So let's go ahead and get started. I want to just quickly return to where we left off on Tuesday, kind of the syllabus-related items, and we left off just briefly talking about the grading policies, and this is the same slide from Tuesday. And I talked about, and there was a few questions about the in-class kind of assessments that we are having, and there's two flavors of these quizzes. I didn't want to use the term exams because it never really reaches that level of exam. So I call them micro quizzes, little MQ, and then macro quizzes, big MQ. They will never be a surprise. We look at our Canvas schedule. They will be on the Thursdays this semester, and effectively every week you will have one. Our very first micro quiz is right now. So what I'm going to have you do is have a computer that is capable of accessing Canvas. I mentioned this in the announcement that technically your phone will suffice. It certainly would for today. It's just not good suggestion in general to be using a phone for these kind of assessments. So a laptop or something with a keyboard is the way to go. And it's going to look pretty similar. So we'll actually proctor this very first micro quiz right now. I'm going to just briefly pause the recording. Let's continue then. I did mention this on Tuesday, but one of the grading policies that I need you to keep in mind for this class is I do want work to be individual work. What you submit is your own. And we have these low-stake assessments, these micro quizzes, and I hope you didn't find the first one too terribly difficult. There was a question you had to get correct to actually get the points for it, but you could go back and try it multiple times. I might have previewed what that question was on Tuesday. There was a true-false question that you do actually have to answer true to get the 2 points for that question. There's no feedback loop that checks if you've actually signed up for the class Discord, but you have to answer true to that question, so please do that to get those 2 points. But I do want your work to be individual work, and I do want these to be our sort of in-person, in-class checkpoints, checking in with each other once a week. And so I really don't want you to be sort of just sharing those codes outside of the class. That's for those who are here, who came to class. You come a minute late, you come 2 minutes late, you come upwards of 6 minutes late. It's not the end of the world, but it's not meant to be, here, let me just message this out, broadcast this out to others. It is an assessment, a very low stakes one, of having come to class and being part of our class. So keep that in mind for these. Again, and you can do the math in terms of how much these are worth, these relatively low stakes assessments here. We're just checking if you're here physically, mentally at some point as well. I talked a lot about your goals for the course, or what I think your goals should be. I also just briefly want to talk about my goals. I mentioned this also on Tuesday. You're in a bunch of different classes. Some of you are in graduate level classes this semester. Every class has kind of a different tenor to it, a different set of goals, and different kind of community that builds up around a particular class. I'd actually like to make this class enjoyable for you, if possible. Not every class has to be this brutal march through the material where you're just hanging on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I don't think this class is that, and it's not my intention for this class to be that. I do want to have the opportunity to challenge you at times, but I think always with a fair challenge along the way. And certainly my hope, really the number one hope, would be to sort of motivate you to learn more in terms of what other courses you could take, after this one. Some of which, depending on your degree program, you may have to take. Others are really optional for you. But this is my simplified, maybe not entirely 100% perfectly correct view of what's in front of you after this semester is over, and where you are now and where you could go. We do put a lot of the cybersecurity courses at the 5,000 level, but they're meant to be obtainable for senior year undergraduates as well. So there's this course, there's the follow-on course that many of you would be taking, the one that's more cryptography focused, and then a bunch of other things you get the opportunity to take. And because this class, 2310, covers a bunch of different topics, I hope it's something kind of sparks your excitement along the way. Maybe not each topic equally so. Some topics will feel more dry, others will feel more maybe engaging to you. But you find the things that you are passionate about through this class, and it doesn't, again, have to be everything. And then you find out what classes make sense for you to take. You maybe already have that entirely planned out, but maybe not, and there are options available to you. And through this class, maybe you'll get a chance to learn more about some of those options. And certainly I want to be an effective instructor for you as well. That's very important to me. Want to talk briefly about the labs. Again, I didn't have this slide up on Tuesday, but I want to make sure we all understand where we are with regards to sort of the syllabus related information regarding the labs. There are 12 labs this semester. That's the basic hands-on learning component of this course. And the idea is to get you some actual hands-on practice with what otherwise is mainly conceptual discussions in class. It should feel very familiar to you, and I think all of you would have had SciB CPRE 2300 because it's using the same internet virtualization, the same security test bed, the same just general feel of you going to the same room in Cougar and connecting to that setup. There is a difference. It's not the same class, right? 2300 is much more about sort of the setup and defensive and understanding the systems. This is much more so we'll provide the setup for you. You're basically given a network for each individual lab, and then you learn how to attack that setup. So it is a different class than 2300. The setup should feel relatively familiar to you. I mentioned this on Tuesday and talked to a student afterward, didn't quite know what I meant. I said the labs are a little color by number, in a sense that 2300's labs are as well, that you're being guided along the way of, here's the next step we'd like you to do, what happens? Here's the next step we'd like you to do, what happens? That can be frustrating at times depending on how you want to explore the technology. We do leave the last few weeks of the semester. Labs 11 and 12 are a two-part final project that are more open-ended. So when you get to those labs, it is much more so attack the following systems, you figure it out. It's fair. It's open-ended, but it's still fair. It's based on what you previously did earlier in the semester, applying that to a new scenario. So those of you who are worried about that kind of do this, then do that, then do this kind of series of labs, there is that. Then later in the semester, it does open up for you. In terms of the grading of the labs, we do rely entirely on the lab report as the mechanism to evaluate your progress. And I mentioned your role as being sort of a professional student in this course, and this is where this comes through as well, which is just don't lose so-called easy points. I provide a report template for each lab. Fill out the report template, make sure what you fill out actually made sense, ensure your answers make sense, and that when there's a requirement for screenshots, that they're present, and that you're actually answering the questions that are there. I do feel like you'll be satisfied with your grade in the labs and in this class if you do that this semester. One of our policies is that lab attendance is mandatory and is part of your lab grade. The thought is for most of these labs, you can complete them in the lab session that you have in Cougar, but if needed, you can continue working on them for the remainder of that week until they are due. But it is expected that you do attend your lab. I will eventually get a chance to be assigned proper TAs for the class. When I do so, I'll meet with them, and we all try to be reasonable people. Things happen in life, and there's reasons one has a job interview or something else is happening and you can't make it to one part. We'll be reasonable people, certainly if you're in communication with us, but the default policy is that you are attending lab on a weekly basis. Even if you look at it and you say this lab is easy, I don't need to go in lab, well, to get credit for that, you have to actually be in the lab. One of the consequences of how we roll out these labs on a week-by-week basis is, while physically the infrastructure is the same, virtually the lab, the intranet that gets deployed to you changes on a weekly basis. And so we do have to be a little firm in terms of the timing of each of these individual labs. It's just kind of a necessity based on how we actually do the deployment of those VM resources to you. So the morning of your lab session, which there is, as you all hopefully know, no one came to lab this morning, I hope. Okay. It'll be released at roughly 6 a.m. the morning of your lab, and they are due no later than midnight the night before the following lab session. I don't think that's going to be an issue, but just be aware that that is how things are going to be set up. And there will be a period of time during the semester in which the infrastructure that is in place for Lab 4, to complete Lab 4, will no longer be in place when you are working on Lab 5. That's just an example, but subsequent labs may not still have that availability of the prior lab infrastructure. So it is a requirement, maybe more so than some of your other courses. I know we sort of trend as a university towards flexible deadlines and things like that. And I don't think this is me trying to be overly strict or harsh. It's just kind of a side effect of or a consequence of this virtual machine setup that we're really not going to be allowing that kind of flexibility this semester. Get your labs done on time. Come to lab, get it done on time. What is quite common is that you'll have worked in the lab and gotten sort of like the raw notes done for the lab in that lab session, and then you have several days to then write it up in a form that you know you'll get a good grade on when you actually go and submit it. But in general, that's sort of the default approach. Can I get another week on lab? The answer is generally going to be no. And not because I'm being a jerk, although sometimes that is the reason, but because actually no, we have to deploy the next lab for everybody, and your lab infrastructure is not going to be available for you to continue past the due date on it. We need to have several ethics chats this semester. Several, although not all of the tools and techniques we use in the lab are real world. They're legitimate. They are industry strength tools used by actual hackers for actual attacks. There's not a separate suite of educational hacking tools and real world education tools. It's all the same software by and large. Now, certainly those of you who are in ECP department as your major, whether it's cybersecurity or others, you separately have to take a whole separate ethics class. And this is not meant to be replacing that. This is more of a warning than an ethics chat. I think the temptation might be there for you that as you're learning things in the lab, and we like students who are naturally inquisitive and want to learn more and want to do more, the temptation maybe would be to try some of the things you're learning in lab and applying them elsewhere. And more of a warning than an ethics chat is my saying to you today, and I'll repeat it, don't do that. I guess is my suggestion, my strong warning for you today. Not on the Iowa State network, not on just even in your home network, there's some risk, and certainly not on any truly public network. There was a time, I think, not that many years ago, where if one wanted to grow their cybersecurity skill set, their ethical hacking, their pen testing skill set, there was almost a requirement that you would have to kind of play around with machines and figure out what works and what doesn't work in sort of an, unfortunately, unsafe manner. That's really not the case today in this world we live in now. Not just our Ice Age lab infrastructure, there are plenty of other both kind of freely available and commercialized efforts to sort of provide that safer, virtualized sort of hacking environment for you to test out and grow your skills. I can help you find some of those resources if the ones that are provided just for this class you're not finding are sufficient, and that's okay. But those resources do exist. There are plenty equivalents to our lab setup out there available for you beyond our lab if you want to keep playing around with these tools, keep trying out new things. The main difference in those resources is how structured or unstructured the access they provide for you is, but those resources do exist. I guess what I'm trying to say is, while the temptation is there and the desire to learn is a good thing, and I want to encourage that, there really is not, in my opinion, an actual need to go mess around with this technology outside of the lab environment, outside of a lab environment. So I just strongly recommend you don't do that. This is meant to be a scary set of federal legislation that you could potentially run afoul of. In the past, I've gotten some pushback on this kind of advice, which is, or you're saying I can't Nmap my dorm. And you probably can. You probably won't get investigated and arrested if you Nmap your dorm. Well, first off, there is something of a blurry line, and we will talk about next week and the week after, between kind of passive investigation and more sort of active efforts to kind of probe things. And some of those tools do kind of cross that blurry line depending on what options you're using for them. So it's not such that you can't listen to traffic on your network, but it's not always that clear when you would be potentially crossing the line. And it's not always within your control what consequences there may be as you try one thing and then try another, and then all of a sudden you actually discover something, and all of a sudden you may in fact be in trouble. And again, the point is not that that makes you necessarily a bad person. I'm not actually talking about the ethics of doing that necessarily, but just sort of the legal consequences potentially of doing that. You'll have a whole separate ethics class. You can talk about the nature of consent and the freedom of information. You can do all the sort of things in that class. I'm just telling you, please be smart. Please don't do it. You just don't need to. At least for this class, to learn the skills we're talking about in this class, you just don't need to. You probably can't read the punchline on that joke, so it's not as funny without it. The idea is being that someone's kind of breaking into a user account and password, and it turns out the approach to kind of protect it is the user account is, what would your mother say if she saw this as the username and the password is, you're smart, you could have gone to work at NASA and now look at you. So it's just kind of like making the hacker sad based on the username and password. I didn't say it was a good joke, I just said it was a joke. A separate and I think equally important note, and probably a version of this note should be in all of your courses because it's equally valid, I think really for all of your courses, at least in engineering, at least in electrical and computer engineering department, is this understanding or at least awareness of how AI kind of fits into the big picture of what you are doing or potentially pursuing as a career path. Now eventually, and it depends on what catalog you find yourself on, you would be required, if you're an ECPE, if you're electrical, computer, or cybersecurity engineer, you'd be required to take a machine learning class. That is a new requirement we have. Those of you who want to take it, I'm teaching it next fall, and if you feel like after one semester you haven't gotten enough of me, come take that class in the fall. But for now, we don't require it. It's just sort of an elective thing. And certainly there's an understanding that across many of our fields, if not all of them, that AI, generative AI, large language models, and the like, will have some impact on your career prospects or the nature of the work you may be doing. I cannot claim I'm such a worldly expert on what the future holds for that. This, so I say my 2 cents, just my opinion, just my personal opinion on where things have been trending. I think the field of pen testing has always been one that has aspects of the job that are very amenable to automation, meaning using software, using scripts to try to automate through sort of the checklist part of the job, the kind of the necessary but not necessarily glamorous aspects of the job. And that's where I've already really seen that AI-assisted tools are shining quite a bit. So that path is probably going to continue. Aspects of the job will continue to be automatable. I firmly believe that with the caveat of absent sort of a true generalized intelligence that actually takes over the world and all that, absent that kind of maybe potentially doomsday scenario, it's still going to be critical to have a knowledge of the underlying context of the real world systems, to be able to use these tools effectively, to be able to discover things that are truly novel in terms of new vulnerabilities. And specifically for cybersecurity and the use of automation, the trend I've seen that is very big right now is this issue of sort of false positives that these tools are notorious for generating. It is a big issue right now in sort of the bug hunting, bug bounty world, that these tools are claiming all sorts of vulnerabilities, and maybe some of them actually are legitimate, but there's a lot of noise kind of burying that signal. So having the sort of human knowledge of what things are actually legitimate or not, understanding the underlying systems, I still think that's pretty critical. So that's my thought, that the trend for you potentially going out into the workforce, potentially becoming an ethical hacker as a career choice, or just working in cybersecurity field in general, is I think the trend is ultimately positive. I think you should feel good. Can't speak for the very long-term future, and again, this is just one person's opinion, but I think the trend is ultimately kind of positive. The tooling is actually going to get better for you to automate the aspects of the job that are not that glamorous in the first place. And hopefully those of you certainly gaining engineering degrees or specializing in this field, it provides more opportunity for you to showcase your sort of deeper human expertise. I don't know if that same positive outlook would be the same if this was an introduction to programming class. Probably, I think I'm still positive on net, but it's a much blurrier picture. I think for pen testing, the picture is still quite positive. Don't give up on your degrees, is the big picture there. This was my attempt to ask ChatGPT to generate the 4 horsemen of the looming AI apocalypse. And I realized as I generated that I don't know students of your age. Do you know who these people are? So Elon Musk, I assume people know who that is. Okay. I listed him as the destabilizer. He doesn't follow rules necessarily for better or for worse. So if something's going to break, he's likely to break it. Do we know who Mark Zuckerberg is? Okay, I would think so. Jensen Huang, does everyone know who Jensen Huang is? That's NVIDIA, yes. The enabler, that's not very fair to him. He just wants to make faster and better GPUs and microprocessors and systems, but it certainly is enabling it. Do you know who Sam Altman is? That's OpenAI, right? Okay, so the deployer, yes, the consuming all of the world's energy to deploy these systems. Okay, so at least some of you knew who all 4 of those were. They impact your life, whether you realize that or not, quite a bit, all 4 of them to some extent or another. I don't have a lot we have to cover of this introductory material. That's not to say get up and leave, but it's to say that, you know, what I wanted to spend the rest of our just time today, and we'll go until we run out of time, and if it seems like it's going fine, then maybe we'll continue on Tuesday, but I reserve the right to kind of just end things when we're done today. I wanted to make sure we were all roughly in the same place with regards to things we remember from 2300. Now, I could have given a lot of quiz questions on that kind of thing. I reserved the right to ask a quiz question about any of these topics, but I thought I would just go through the very high-level understanding of what I think you need to remember from 2300. I'll ask a couple questions, but typically it's the same 2 or 3 students who answer them. That's fine. I'm going to kind of look for head nodding when I bring open these things. And that's fine, though, if you look at this slide, for instance, and you say, I have no idea what's going on in this slide. That's okay. You're still probably in the right class, but you may want to look back at your 2300 materials if none of this makes any sense to you. The difference possibly, to some extent, between what one has to know when you're taking an introduction to networking class and what one needs to know when you're doing a pen testing class like this. Maybe I'm a little biased, but the difference is it gets real in a sense that it doesn't if you're just taking a networking class, that there's still so much abstraction available to you when doing a networking class, even if you're writing software code. But now we actually need to know, not just, yes, there's flags in a header packet and then this payload goes here. We actually have to know that at a pretty deep level to be able to do what we do when we're doing pen testing. So even if this does make sense to you, that's what I want to get across for the rest of today, maybe a little bit of Tuesday. That it's not just something written in a textbook. It's actually quite real, and I'll try to show that as best I can based on my conceptual view of things. So here is a completely stolen slide from someone else where we have an attacker over the internet. You have your router and you have your user machines. What does the /24 mean? Can somebody tell me? What was it? It's a subnet. What does it literally mean then in this case? /24. It is a definition of a segmenting of this particular network. Specifically, sorry. You have 254 devices. That is also true. Okay, that's correct. It's literally just a shorthand notation. All your answers are correct. All your answers are completely correct. It is a bit mask. It is a subnet mask. It is saying that I have a network that's defined, and I realize as I put this slide together that everything we still do is very IPv4 kind of biased. We can make an equivalent slide for IPv6. It would just be a lot uglier, I guess. A lot of the things are still roughly the same. But we define a network via that description. We are saying that we have the 192.168.1 subnet, and that 24 actually refers to 24 bits. We're saying 24 bits are kind of fixed for this network. The other way you would see this written is you have the subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. 24 out of the 32 bits are fixed. You then have 8 bits of flexibility with regards to defining what IP addresses you can have on that particular network. So what is a valid IP address for the user machine? Someone said 254 machines. That is correct. Another way to answer the question is, what are 2 reserved IP addresses for the user machines? Do we know? .0 is reserved, and what's the other one? That's right. So sometimes I think it's important for us to really be pretty fluent in digital and base 2. And maybe it's just me trying to show how clever I am, maybe not. 32-bit IP address for IPv4, 24 bits are fixed. That's 8 bits for this number, 8 bits for this number, 8 bits for this number. That last one, that's not fixed. That's what you get to change. That's 8 bits. When you have 8 bits of anything, 8 true-false values, 8 light switches, whatever you want to think of it as, that's 256 different things you can encode, because 2 to the 8 is 256. So you kind of think of there as being 256 machines. As part of the IP spec, 2 of those are reserved, one of them as a broadcast, one of them as a default gateway address for it. That's how many machines you could have on this particular IP address space. It used to matter a lot how much IP space an organization has, and it still does matter to some organizations who are maybe in cloud computing and other industry segments. But now, what we generally do, we generally have a network architecture that looks to some extent, at some level, like this, where we really only need to have a small amount of IP address space that is globally accessible, and then everything else is going to be just internal to our own network. And in this case, when we have 192.168, that is what that is reserved for, but we're really saying that there is some publicly available internet address, and the rest can all be just internally accessible here. What is the IP address of the router? That's more of a conceptual than an actually answerable question. Conceptually, what is the IP address for the router in this setup? Well, it could be .1. Well, first off, it's something we would define. We get to define it. So it's not required that our gateway has to be of a fixed address. We can specify what it is. Another way to think about this router is the assumption is that it's acting as a gateway for these user machines. That's not necessarily the case in the diagram, but that's the assumption here, is that the router is really routing between 2 interfaces. So what is the IP address of the router? It presumably has 2 IP addresses ultimately. There is the IP address that is kind of visible to the internet writ large. And if you don't want to think of that, but just think of the next layer of network, that's fine. It's the address that is visible to that next layer of network. And then there is sort of the internal address that we have here as well. And the router's job, beyond routing, assuming it's also acting as a gateway, is to do that kind of translation, that we have an IP address that is corresponding to this network that the internet or the next level of network is aware of, and that router's job is to then figure out what actual resource on that user machines in the internal network is corresponding to that particular request here. So if there's a vulnerability on a user machine, can an attacker exploit it? Not a very good question. Maybe. The answer is maybe, right? It depends. It depends on what you would have learned about in 2300, what kind of paths are available from the attacker somewhere on the internet to that particular user machine, what traffic is allowed to traverse those paths, and of course, what the role of the router it has or whatever software firewall is running on those particular machines. Again, I'm looking more for kind of head nods that you've seen this before and it's not completely a foreign language. Right, this gets covered in 2300, is this? Okay, that's the head nod I'm looking for. The Open Systems Interconnection or OSI model, that's that conceptual framework, right? Used to understand, also to some extent, standardize the functioning of a networking system. And that model has 7 layers. Each layer has a specific role. Each layer communicates with the layers directly above and directly below it. That's something you learn via a textbook. In practice, so much of what we do is using TCP/IP, which is really similar in terms of, but it's more of an actual as-applied implementation of the OSI model that is used in actual real-world networking. The main difference is, opposed to having the 7 models of the OSI model, 7 layers of the OSI model, we have just the 4 layers. The important ones, though, are really starting, you could either start top, bottom, or you can start bottom up. The physical layer, that is the actual physical connection between devices, how raw data bits are getting physically transferred over the network. Of course, that's really critical when we're talking about wireless networking and the many different ways that we can do that kind of transmission. Or if you just want to think about it as how the Ethernet cable gets defined, that's fine as well. It is both of those things. There's then the next layer, that's the data link layer here. Oftentimes we kind of combine those two layers into one IEEE standard corresponding to something like 802.11b or just Ethernet standards here. The data link layer, that's an attempt to make sure that we have reliable physical communication here. That's where things like error codes or communication codes and error detection and correction, that's where things like our MAC addresses are also getting encoded directly in. That's helping logically do the transferring of the ones and zeros. So layer 1 is like a cable that has certain copper properties to it and has certain noise and signal properties of the physical wire. Certainly if it's RF spectrum, there's all sorts of things that are encoded there. Data link is how do I get the ones and zeros effectively and reliably across that wire. We think of the TCP IP model as the default so much that the network layer is not that well defined. We think of it as like the IP layer, but it's really referring to the same thing. That's where we're talking about routing between different devices on your network. So IP is the Internet Protocol, is that key protocol. Next layer is transport. We have the transport protocol. That's how we're ensuring more reliable across multiple systems that are transversing across multiple hops. That's your TCP, that's your UDP. There's others now as well. And then while there are certain application layers that talk about things like presentation and session information, we oftentimes just group that all into just the application layer. That's sort of the networking software or like the networking service view of things. That's the user applications. That's like HTTP to access a web page, or SMTP to send an email, or SSH to securely connect to another computer, or DNS and things of the like. That is a software definition of how we should use those lower layers to reliably transmit some important user information so that we can write software and have applications here. Then we have the concept of the protocol data unit. And again, that's a textbook concept that I think it's important to keep in mind that it's very real. And I can bring up Wireshark here, and I think you would have already done that in 2300 to kind of remind yourself that it's all very real, that it's not just like this conceptual way of layering and abstracting our data here. Protocol data unit, just a unit of data that is specified at a particular layer at a particular protocol in the TCP, IP, or OSI model here. Each layer in the networking stack kind of adds to the layer below it. So we're at the physical layer, we're talking just ones and zeros. Now once we have our Ethernet frames, we add some header information on top of it. Now when we have IP packets, we're taking all those same bits, we're adding some header information on top of it, so on and so forth. It is a layering, but it is a very physical thing at the end of the day. Maybe I'm repeating myself. Maybe you've all got it, and that's fine if you do. That I can show you diagrams like this until we're kind of blue in the face. And again, it depends if you want to think top down or bottom up. Either approach of thinking about your network is valid. Oftentimes, certainly for more software focused people, we think about what is our goal, what do we actually want to transmit, and why. So if that's how you think, you definitely want to think in terms of application down. Maybe if you're more of a double E and like to think about like how does a 1 get across a wire, then you start bottom and work your way up. But it's the same concept either way. Starting in the top and working our way down, we have some data we want to transmit from one piece of software to another, one computer to another. That's fine. You can think of it that way. I want to know what IP address is associated with www.google.com. I have to do a DNS request. That is an application layer protocol that's effectively, depending on what version you're using, in plain text. We're basically almost in human understandable verbiage saying, who has this network name? What is their IP address? Please tell me. That's a DNS request. We'll talk more about DNS and its implications here. as part of the OSI or TCP/IP view of things. That is, it's all ones and zeros at the end of the day. That is some application data that then is going to get wrapped into TCP, then TCP/IP packet, where we're including just the other information there, like what is the source IP address, where's the data coming from, what is the destination IP address, where is the data going to on the TCP level, what particular port does this network traffic correspond to, and then finally, as we get to lower and lower level stuff, what are things like the destination and source MAC address, so that we make sure things actually get routed the way we want them to. We can see all the connections we have if we run a command like netstat here. We can open up netstat. Let's make this a little bit larger. Okay, my smart autocomplete already knows what I want to autocomplete. You can run this on your own computer. You can run this on a lab computer. Netstat is basically just checking what are all the open connections on that particular machine. I did netstat-a, which is actually probably going to provide you more information than what you're probably, depends on what your goal is, than what you're probably looking for here. And it's going to tell you things like what are the active network connections, what TCP or what protocol in the various protocol stacks are they actually using, what ports are we connecting to, what ports are we listening from. You can also query things like what is the routing information we have here. And I think if you, this is my own personal computer, if you do this on your computer, you will find that even if your computer doesn't feel like you're doing very much, it's actually got a lot of networking going on at all times. I did not come prepared to say exactly what all of the, we could probably figure it out though. The very first entry says TCP4, that's just shorthand for IPv4, TCP over IP. It is connected from, you now know my computer's name, and connected to icehost23.isdate, source port, destination port, network connection. Web browser is open to that web page. Bunch of TCP6 going on, which is usually not nearly as human readable to know exactly what's happening. Sometimes that information also can leak things like geographic relative proximity and the like, but bunch of IPv6 connections going on here. OBS is phoning home. I don't know, that's good to know. I mean, I have an open connection to obsproject.com. I guess I have to trust them. If I don't trust them, I'm in big trouble anyway. I don't know what plenty of these are. One could go down line by line and try to figure out who is listening to what and for what reason. Some of these, and this goes to when you eventually would take a networking class where you actually write software to implement protocols, is this sort of old school Unix philosophy that's still really alive today, is that we also use this networking paradigm for sort of inter-process communication as well. So a lot of the sockets and the network connections we're looking at right now aren't really going anywhere. They're really just connections on my machine from one piece of software on my machine to another piece of software on my machine. Still have to be aware of that, I guess, but that's what many of these connections would be here. That's what these would be. These would be just Unix stuff communicating with each other using data sockets. And so not necessarily the same thing we're talking about here, but using the same underlying technology. And I was curious if we're connecting to Apple at all here, but that's also just kernel processes as well. So that's also a similar concept where it's not going to com.apple.net. That's not a website. That is just an internal kernel process. So the primary ones were those first few in that list. There's a decent number of them, even though ostensibly I'm not doing anything on the network right now. There's a lot of things that are connected here. You can learn about that via a netstat command. I think it's probably important for you now in 2310, if it wasn't previously important for you, to have a reasonable memory or have a good journal or a way of writing it down that you know the so-called well-known port numbers. 64K possible ports. That's not a magic number. Again, that's a consequence of there being 16 bits to encode the port number. There's divided into so-called well-known ports, just the lower 10 bits, or the other potential registered / dynamic ports. I'm not saying you have to memorize all of these. It's not asking too much, though, to memorize all of those. And I think if you're working in this field, that's kind of table stakes as well, that you are aware that when you see a connection on port 80 that is a temp of HTTP, 443 for HTTPS, and the rest of those, and there's more that we'll come across as we go on this semester, but that's pretty common to be aware of those ports that tend to be used. It's kind of an interesting thing that it's not really a requirement that any servers actually use those ports. Depends on what software you're using and depending on how much control you have over the software that you are using. It's not actually required that if you're connecting over SSH that you use port 22, and you most certainly can have an SSH server listening on all sorts of different ports here. That is just the default, to some extent standardized depending on the application we're talking about, way of communicating over those ports. But I think it's okay to assume that those are in use by default. And just having that written down, print out the slide if you don't want to write it down. Just being aware of those ports, I think, is a reasonable thing to do here. Continuing our review, and I see we're fading a little bit, the TCP three-way handshake. Does this sound familiar? I'm looking over on this side shaking vigorously, this side a little bit less vigorously. That's okay. We will actually have to have a deeper knowledge of this than in 2300. It turns out that if you don't do the handshake properly, you can learn a lot of things about systems, is why we need to know about it. But for now, at a very high level, this is all you need to know as of today from 2300. That is a handshake. And you can think of it as like a phone call, which is we're first kind of requesting a sync request where we're saying, hi, Bob, can you hear me? We're getting some sort of response back saying, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? And then that third part of the handshake is, yes, let's talk. Let's start our communication. Open a request, get an acknowledgement of that request to open, and then acknowledge the acknowledgement effectively is what we are doing there. That is the so-called three-way handshake. And again, it is a very real thing, okay? This is just a screenshot of Wireshark. Let me open up Wireshark in the very limited time we have remaining today. This would be on one of your Ice Age computers, one of what would be potentially your lab computer. Again, there's nothing wrong with running Wireshark, but it is a more controlled environment that you can run it without worrying about any security issues. There's a lot of things here, but I think we just want to capture default port. Okay, we are running Wireshark, and this is a virtualized system in which nothing is going on. That's fine. Let's ping google.com. The screen could be a little bit larger. Give me just a second here. That's as large as it's going to be in this class. I guess you can see that. And here we're spamming for google.com. And that's what I mean by this is a very real thing, right? It's not just like theoretically that you have a ping request and that's sending an ICMP packet and it's providing this response, and that there's these corresponding bits corresponding to this particular fields of headers in a TCP IP or ICMP packet that we have here. You can click on any one of these packets, and this is just one tool amongst many. Let's kill the ping for just a second here. Poor Google might not be able to handle all the traffic we're sending its way. Thank you. And you can look at any one of those packets, and it's not super human readable, but the ones and zeros here encoded as hex are exactly what is listed as the spec for that traffic. We can then say, we said there's a three-way handshake. Let's go to a different one here. That was ping. If we actually want to guarantee a TCP, let's like grab whatever the website is at google.com, wget, just grab that information. Grabbed google.com, they'll be okay. And I should now be able to see several things going on here. I might have to scroll back to actually filter out what I need to see. Oftentimes the issue with something like Wireshark is there's so much networking traffic happening, it can be kind of hard to focus in on one particular thing here. But we should actually be able to see as part of that traffic. So that would be an application level, so we have to go a little bit earlier. Echo, that's our ping request. And then our application layer request. I don't know how easy that is for you to see. A GET request. That is an HTTP, that is that application layer protocol. Get me www.google.com. That is at an application layer. What happens to be able to do that? Well, there had to have been some way of knowing what IP address to access. We should have that information, that we were able to access that. And along the way, there should be that three-way handshake. Bob, I'd like to, what was it, Bob and Alice? What did I say? What did I put in there? Bob, can you hear me? Instead of Bob, Google, can you hear me? Google says, yes, I can hear you. Please stop pinging me. Acknowledge, yes, we can start our communication. Now I can actually send that application layer information on. Let's leave things here for today. There's still a bit more review I just want us to get through on Tuesday, and then we'll get started really in earnest on Tuesday. Thank you.